maybe we should just go into that actually a little bit. What were your experiences in Gaza? What did you see? I mean, you say the IDF wants you to just report fairly, but did you have critiques of what they were doing?
Yeah, I did. I wrote about it in Spectator. I've written about it on my Substack. And the first thing I think that needs addressing is just how destroyed the place is. There's no point sugarcoating it. The wreckage of Rafah was shocking, even for someone who's been in war zones, who's called for airstrikes, and who was expecting it to be bad. Even then, it still, physically took me back to see how wrecked the place was. But the fairness comes in when you look at why, and I think that's the really important thing here. Is it because the IDF has been bombing indiscriminately and just smashing the place up for fun? Or is there a better reason? And there is a better reason, and it's because Hamas have booby-trapped and dug tunnels underneath and weaponized huge tracts of Gaza. And if you look at the maps that you can see, Honest Reporting have done an interactive map of the tunnels identified. They're everywhere, longer than the London Underground in distance, longer than the Paris Metro or the New York subway, 500 kilometers of tunnels under this place. And on top of that, you have 57,000 shafts coming up from those tunnels that lead to people's houses, children's bedrooms, mosques, hospitals, you name it.
Yeah.
And when Hamas are putting IEDs, improvised explosive devices, in these tunnels, as a military kind of going through and trying to clear that, you've got two options. You either commit your engineers to clearing, thousands of IEDs one at a time, or you just level it. And if you're trying to maintain any sort of momentum in a military operation, you cannot be stopping every house to wait for the engineers to come in and defuse.
What, in real terms, what is the sort of time difference between those two different approaches?
So in Afghanistan, if we found an IED and we called out improvised explosive device disposal teams, we're talking hours and hours just for one device. So in Afghanistan, we would go firm. We would call forward the EOD. We would wait for them to arrive. That could take any time, given depending on how busy they were elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
They then take the time they needed to defuse it, which also takes a lot of time because it's a very slow, meticulous process for obvious reasons. And then, of course, once they've cleared the first device, you have to make sure there's no secondary devices anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And in Gaza, actually, one of the things they're seeing is that these devices are actually remote operated. So they're not victim operated, like in Afghanistan, where you tread on a pressure plate and the device activates. They're on a wire in Gaza, and they've actually got cameras with wires going down into the tunnels. And Hamas are watching for people to enter the buildings. And when they enter, they physically detonate the bomb. So that makes EOD impossible because it's under Hamas's control for the entirety of its existence. So the IDF really don't have any other tactical options but to level the building either through an airstrike or through a controlled detonation using a dozer. They've been using bulldozers heavily in Gaza in a way that I don't think has ever been done before in urban warfare. So there's lessons to learn about how the IDF have done this.
Doesn't really sound like a critique. I mean, you are kind of somewhat preaching to the converted. Like, I agree that with what you're saying, or I agree that that's an appropriate way of dealing with that issue for the IDF, but that's not a critique of the IDF. That's actually a defense of the IDF.
I don't think it is. I think because I'm looking at both what the options are on the table and making an assessment as to whether they're reasonable and appropriate or not. And I think
You're saying they're not appropriate?
No, I think they are.
So there's a defense then of what they're doing?
Well, no, because if I come to the opposite conclusion, I'd say that also. So I'm weighing up all the alternatives here. So, alternative one is you deploy EOD. Is that feasible? Probably not. Option two is doing what they're doing. Is that feasible? Yes. And there aren't really any other options here. That's the issue. We can certainly critique things like IDF discipline. Let's talk about that. On my visit to the Netzarim corridor, I went to one of the camps with 252 Division, which is a reserve division. And with a professional eye, I thought it was a shambles, quite frankly. The camp laydown was scattered. The troops they weren't as switched on as you would expect. To find someone to talk to us, they were essentially going round the blokes and asking who speaks English. There was no real organisation. Their command structure is incredibly flat. So generals will get phone calls from staff sergeants that they know in real life, and they'll be arcing the entire chain of command out of the picture. And we can see how that plays out in real time when we look at the start of the war, and there were all those sort of selfies of IDF soldiers making idiots of themselves in Gaza. And that is a reflection of their command culture and the discipline. or the lack thereof that we see in the IDF. So if you want actual criticism, that's a criticism. A critique, I think, is looking at all the options on the table and deciding whether or not they're appropriate and correct or not.
Okay, I see. Well, let's just stick on Gaza then for a moment. This is since your visit, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been set up, American-backed group, and there's been some, scandal would be to say the least, but it's very confusing to work out exactly what's going on because different things are being reported, and not least by the BBC or re-reported by the BBC and Haaretz and Al Jazeera. And so this foundation was set up to bring aid to Gaza. There was some reports that the IDF had been shooting indiscriminately at them. Then the GHF, I think this was about 2 months, this was maybe even a month ago, reported actually, in fact, it's Hamas who are shooting at us. Then another story came out from the Times of Israel, which I consider a lot more reliable than Haaretz, who was saying actually it was in fact the IDF who had been shooting at Gazans. Initially, the story was that they were shooting directly, and they were ordered to shoot at them, and it was a mistranslation of the Hebrew, and they were ordered to shoot in the direction to discourage people coming to a certain area. But then, as I said, Times of Israel later said, no, in fact, dozens were killed by IDF, and even the IDF admitted, mistakes were made. So there's a sort of a conversation that I'd like to have with you about how the media is covering all of this. But what's your analysis of the aid distribution to Gaza? This seems to be the most controversial issue at the moment.
Yeah, let's take the tactical stuff aside and we'll come back to that. I think if we look at the strategy behind it, it makes a lot of sense, because if your objective as a military campaign is to essentially dismantle Hamas, to remove their administrative functions, remove their ability to attack Israel in future, remove their ability to control the Gaza Strip, you have to attack their levers of control. And the biggest lever of control they've had this war is aid, where significant percentages of it have been diverted to Hamas, where they've used it to pay, sell it and pay their soldiers, where they've used it as a mechanism to control the people of Gaza. So at a strategic level, it makes perfect sense to try and separate the people of Gaza from Hamas. And that actually goes back to the same counterinsurgency strategy that we in the West use. I mean, it's not been hugely successful in recent years, but the underpinning ethos behind it is that you separate the insurgent from the people.
How on earth do you do that in
Gaza? And exactly, and that's been part of the trouble the IDF have had, I think, for the last, 21 months, is that there's nowhere for the people to go. And even if they move to the humanitarian zones, Hamas can move with them. And that's why we've seen strikes in humanitarian zones in Gaza, because Hamas go there too. Of course they do. When your entire strategy is to hide behind people, you go where the people are. If we look at the tactical or strategic other side, it makes perfect sense for Hamas to have done that. But I think if you can cut the aid, you're cutting Hamas's finances, you're cutting people's reliance on them for food and for food distribution. Now, I'm not saying Hamas distributed every gram of food that's gone into Gaza during the war. I mean, I think the most recent, most credible estimate I've seen is about 25% of aid was being diverted by Hamas.
Oh, so only 75% was getting to the people?
Yeah, exactly that. Mm-hmm. And even then, obviously, distribution problems in a war zone, that's why if there is hunger in Gaza, that's where it comes from. It's from the challenges of that distribution. Because, I mean, we know that double the aid has gone in to Gaza than went in before the war. In terms of the amount of food that's gone in. So there was no starvation before the war, and now there's twice as much going in, and yet there's starvation. So it's clearly on the distribution side that the issue is. And so it makes strategically perfectly good sense for the GHF to go in and try what they're trying. And it seems to be broadly successful. If we take away the noise around people getting shot, and we can talk about that, tens of millions of meals are getting distributed. So it seems to be a plan that works. And when you couple that with other efforts, for example, empowering rival clans in Gaza to seize areas, seize the control of those areas away from Hamas, that sort of dual strategy, I think, does separate the people from Hamas. And it's whether, I think, under the imminently proposed ceasefire, Israel has the chance to finish that job, is what will decide whether or not Hamas remains in control.
We'll come to the ceasefire, but just on then, given your military background, when you hear that the IDF, even they themselves admit that they kill people at this aid distribution, and that mistakes were made, I think, or something like that. From a military point of view, given your experience, how do you interpret that sort of information?
Again, it sounds to me, reading between the lines, and obviously I don't know categorically because I've not been there, I've not seen it, I've not seen the incident reports, so I'm not going to specify, what definitely happened. But what it sounds like to me is that they have tried to use weapons fire as a means of controlling the population. And by controlling, what I mean is, first of all, protecting themselves, the IDF, from people who would be approaching their positions. Because for context, the way it works is there's a GHF site that has armed contractors doing the intimate local security for that, with IDF essentially oversight, a bit removed. So if you have people approaching the IDF positions, it is reasonable that you would fire warning shots to keep people back. There's normally an escalatory pathway. I haven't seen the exact IDF one in the vicinity of the GHF sites, but I have seen their procedures in Netzarim, which is originally a warning verbally, then a low warning shot, and then a kind of injury warning shot. So there is an escalatory pathway here. So that's one option it could be. Trying to keep people away from certain areas, that could be an option. Frankly, these aren't great tactics. It's not what you choose as your first option. If you had to, if you had the full menu of military tactics to choose from, that's not the one you choose. Mm-hmm. But again, if we go back to what I was saying in Rafah about the IEDs, look at the options on the table here to try and do crowd control. They can't kit up into riot gear and push forward because they'd be exposed to attacks from Hamas, IEDs, small arms fire. And just the other day, we saw hand grenades thrown into one of the GHF sites, which I think it wounded or killed 2 of the contractors that were in there. Wow. So that was just in the last couple of days. So the threat is real, and it's far too high a threat, I think, to push out full public order formations. I think the IDF accept that they didn't get their signage right, they didn't get their kind of crowd control barriers and stuff right, and they've adapted and they've changed that. Mm-hmm. Frankly, that's a very basic error to have made. Mm-hmm. I think questions do need to be asked about why that wasn't done from the offset. They must have known large crowds would come to these sites, so why were they not having at least barriers in place to sort of channel people towards the right place and make sure there's not crushing and that sort of thing? But this is a kinetic war zone, and on top of that, Hamas have every incentive to try and get the IDF to open fire. And I think that is a factor that people seem to totally ignore in this war, is that you can't look at a war and just judge one side's actions in isolation. You have to look at both sides, because war is reaction and counter-reaction. And if you're not looking at both sides here, then you're not doing an honest job of analysis. Mm-hmm. And Hamas know this will harm them. You can see by the way the disinformation storm around the GHF has rampaged up to unprecedented levels, as it always does when Hamas is under pressure. So the fact we're seeing that shows it's working in many ways. And the one thing they want to do is stop people going to those sites and keep them coming to the Hamas warehouses and the mass distribution sites.
Because it's their way of controlling Gazans
exactly
themselves.
That.
Okay.
And so Hamas has every incentive to draw fire. And I suspect when they do an investigation into this, they will find Hamas presence and Hamas kind of instigation of some of these incidents. Mm-hmm. And then I think the final point to note is the allegations of wildly, indiscriminately firing into crowds doesn't quite add up, because the weapon systems they're alleging the IDF are using are the big guns. We're talking mortars, we're talking tank rounds, we're talking snipers. If they were using those weapon systems, you would see hundreds of casualties a day. Even the Haaretz article said it was 1 to 5 fatalities a day. Okay, with one mortar round, you would get 1 to 5 fatalities, just one round. And if they're launching indiscriminately mortars and tank rounds and bullets in, you would see hundreds and hundreds of deaths. So that allegation doesn't make any sense to me, unless the IDF are the worst shots in the planet, which I don't think they are, having seen them in action. Mm-hmm. So there is a very skewed version of this, which is clearly incorrect. Are the IDF completely free of any blame or mistakes here? No, I don't think that's true either. So as ever, the truth will be somewhere in the middle, and you have to look at both sides before you make a final analysis.
Let's come to the ceasefire then. Witkoff's deal. The most striking thing about this to me is that it allows Hamas to continue existing. Now, can Israel say that the war objectives or the war has been in any way won, and there's a secure, that peace can be secured for the future if Hamas still exists?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And I think there is a core contradiction that's been the bane of Israel's strategic objectives from the start, from 7th of October onwards. And that is, how do you destroy Hamas and return the hostages? How are those two things going to be reconciled? And it means that one of them has to compromise. And it's as simple as that. Military action is not going to recover the hostages. The IDF already holds 65%-ish of Gaza. They've killed almost every Hamas commander. They've killed 20,000 plus Hamas combatants. And yet there are still a significant number of hostages. And the vast majority that have been freed through deals. We can think back to Operation Arnon, where the special forces went in and rescued 4 hostages. That was minutes or seconds away from being a total disaster. And it was only danger close airstrikes that allowed those troops and the hostages to get away safely. That was kind of April last year, I think, off the top of my head. It might have been June, but yeah, it was sort of early, first half of last year. And I think that deterred the IDF from trying those again. We also know that hostages have been executed when the IDF have gotten too close. We saw that with Hersh Goldberg Polin and the other 5 that were killed alongside him. There's every bit of evidence to suggest that they were killed because the IDF were closing in. So military hostage recovery isn't going to happen. Military pressure might drive Hamas to the negotiating table, and I think that's what we're seeing here. But that still needs negotiations, which means somebody's going to have to make a compromise on both sides. So what we have to then look at, I think, when we're gauging success or failure, is looking at the extent to which strategic goals have been achieved. Hamas are now no longer a threat in the sense of 7th of October. They don't have the capability or the ability to repeat that. So for now, Israel's border is secured.
I mean, they're still selling missiles, and not on the level of October 7th, but they are a huge threat to the future, and they're a threat, most of all, to the Gazans themselves.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that. If we look at the missiles, we're talking 1 or 2 popped off Iron Dome, or it's more than capable to deal with them. So, in terms of being an actual credible threat, not really.
Okay.
Governance still in existence. Quite clearly, they still govern huge tracts of the Gaza Strip. So that's not been achieved. And the killer piece of this ceasefire deal is, are they then going to have the ability to recover and regain where they were? And that's the really killer question that I think hinges the success or failure of the mission, quite frankly. Because if there is a deal that, a 60-day ceasefire turns into a permanent ceasefire, turns into reconstruction without the correct oversight to make sure Hamas can't seize that reconstruction stuff and start rebuilding tunnels and terror bases, etc., etc. And if Israel doesn't have the right to strike back in when they see that happening, then that is a real problem. And I would agree that you could probably say the war hasn't been a success if Hamas are in a position to rebuild.